director of this nonprofit, and our mission is to close gaps in maternal mental health care. One of the ways that we do that is by lifting up best practices and finding solutions that are actually closing gaps. And we do that through many programs, but today we're here to talk about our Innovation Award program and introduce to you the winner of the Innovation in Policy and Advocacy category. With us today are Dr. Susan Feingold and Barry Lewis. We'll introduce them in just a moment. And I also wanted to quickly announce and thank that the Zoma Foundation has made this program, our Innovation Award program, possible. And we thank you, Zoma Foundation, for making this work have so much meaning and ability to scale and share it with others. You can see on my screen, there's a picture of both myself here and also our two panelists. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them in just a moment, but I'm going to ask you first. There's a couple of you on the line, and I'd like you, Brooke, to join me. And Brooke is the program director of our Innovation Award program. We're going to ask those of you on the line to introduce yourself using the Q&A feature in your GoToWebinar control panel. So there's a few of you on the line right now, and we'd love for all of you to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from, what your name is, and why you're interested in today's webinar. And then, Brooke, I'm going to have you read those off as they come in. So again, those of you in attendance today, please use the Q&A feature on the GoToWebinar control panel to introduce yourself. Your name, the city that you're in, and why you're interested in today's webinar. And then, Brooke, I'm going to just pause here and see if anyone was brave enough to do that for us and have you read those things for us.
Okay, Joy, I'm looking to see.
We'd love to know if you are clinician, attorney, advocate. Have any responses come in, Brooke?
I haven't seen any just yet.
Okay, we'll come back to that in just a moment as those responses come in. And so, without further ado, we'll have time for Q&A throughout the session, but we'll take most of the questions at the end of the session, and Brooke will be reading those off for us. Don't be shy about using that Q&A feature. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce formally both Dr. Feingold and Barry Lewis. Dr. Feingold is a clinical psychologist and the author of the book, Happy Endings, New Beginnings, Navigating Postpartum Disorders, and she's also a member of the President's Advisory Council for Postpartum Support International. She has over 25 years specializing in women's reproductive mental health. She's also an adjunct professor at Illinois School for Professional Psychology. And Susan, you're going to have to mention the second name, Advocacy University, I think is how it's pronounced. And she received
Advocacy.
Thank you, Susan.
It's just part of the Illinois School of Professional Psychology.
Very good. And Susan received the 2016 Distinguished Alumni Award for her work in perinatal mental health. Susan, welcome. I'm also pleased to introduce Barry Lewis. Barry has been a trial attorney for the past 43 years. Barry, you look like you're about 43. That's hard to believe. He was born and raised and educated and has been employed, of course, in Chicago and its suburbs. And he has never lived or worked anywhere else. That's pretty amazing, Barry, and unusual these days. His trial experience includes countless not guilties in criminal cases. He is the author of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers magazine and article, Postpartum Depression and the Law. A new law offers new hope, and we're going to be talking about that today. And a 2013 honoree by Chicago Volunteer Legal Services for his work. He has lectured many times, including at the Marseille, North America, and Postpartum Support International conferences, as well as the Psychological Association conference. He continues to advocate for the underdog. I love that, Barry. Welcome to you and to Susan. We're thrilled to have you. I'm going to start off by asking you, Susan, and we'll flip through the next couple of slides to tell us first, what is postpartum psychosis, which is really the crux of the law and the clinical disorder that your law focused on. And so I love that you want to first cover these issues. So if you can talk to us first about identification and prevalence of postpartum psychosis.
Sure. Well, first of all, there's a range of postpartum illnesses, and what we know is there's somewhere between 800,000 and 900,000 women in the U.S. that have perinatal, during pregnancy or postpartum, mood and anxiety disorders. And in that group, 10 to 15% experience depression or anxiety or panic disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. But the most severe of the perinatal disorders is postpartum psychosis, which affects about 1 to 2 out of 1,000 women. And so that's sort of where our law takes place, is within that very rare severe form. And so I have a slide in which I indicate what are the symptoms of postpartum psychosis, and that includes, basically loss of sense of reality with delusions, or what's considered delusions are false beliefs, and or hallucinations, as well as a delirium. And a delirium is when there's confusion and a cognitive disorientation. So these are some of the symptoms: paranoid, bizarre, or grandiose thinking, a decreased need for sleep, mood swings and lability, and a dramatic change in one's usual functioning. And, basically of that 1 to 2 of 1,000 women, tragic cases are even more rare within that group. What we know is there are about 4 to 5% of these women who in fact commit suicide. And we say 1 to 4% is what we can estimate who commit infanticide or neonaticide. And so you're in this brief temporary psychotic state. These women sometimes commit crimes, and that's sort of where the law is focused on these women who commit crimes because of a mental illness, and rather than getting mental health treatment, we'll go into this later if you want, but rather than getting mental health treatment in our country, it's treated as a homicide, and these women get long sentences, life sentences, and in some states the death penalty. So that seems wrong. And so that's where we became involved.
So perfect. And it's obvious that we're failing these women twice, aren't we? We first are not detecting and properly treating these disorders, and then when something tragic happens, we do something like this, right? Incarcerate them or even provide the death penalty. Thank you so much for that overview. We're going to flip to the next slide, which you just went over, the incidents. And can you talk a little bit about the symptoms as well, Susan?
So the symptoms, there is that slide in which we talked about the symptoms. And so, there's this change. And the difficulty with postpartum psychosis is it often presents very early on. It's the most severe of the postpartum disorders. Some of these women, in fact, had never had mental health problems or any psychosis until, like everybody else, they just wanted to have a baby and a family. And then, it took them down this very dark road, and they started to become psychotic. It usually really presents pretty early on, although it is possible that someone can have such a severe depression that they start to become psychotic. So the symptoms are all listed, and that was what I just had gone over a few minutes ago. But what you're looking for is a dramatic change in functioning. The one of the difficulties with this is, particularly with postpartum psychosis, symptoms can wax and wane. So someone could seem like they're getting better or they're fine one second, and the next second they're acting very bizarre, and you kind of see unusual behavior. So that's a problem in terms of the legal system, because sometimes it makes it look like, well, this woman committed some kind of terrible crime, most often infanticide or neonaticide we're talking here. But they seemed fine. They just went to the store, an hour ago, and now they're sort of in their own head and acting very bizarrely. So it can shift that way. And that makes it a particularly quite a challenge for mental health people, as well as, it creates a challenge in the criminal justice system for it to seem like, in fact, these women really are mentally ill.
It's such a great point. I have two follow-up questions, Susan. One is, and related to that point, Barry, this might be one that you want to address. We know often the legal definition of sanity is knowing right from wrong. And I think to your point here, because these symptoms and these breaks in reality can kind of wax and wane, where a mother might be in her quote unquote right mind at one point, and perhaps when she's interviewed after a crime, but may not have been at the time the crime was committed. Do either of you want to touch on that?
Well, sure. The problem is that, just like you mentioned, the law is very conservative in this regard. The law kind of tends to assume that any person who doesn't have a lengthy history of mental illness, severe mental illness, who claims insanity as a defense, is using that as a pretext. That's simply inapplicable to the situation of a postpartum psychosis, because postpartum psychoses can wax and wane. They can come on suddenly. No one, I don't know how many of the audience is familiar with the case of Cynthia Wachenheim, but that's just a great case for the purpose of clarifying just the nature of this disease and how it can come on so suddenly. No one detected that Wachenheim was actually falling into psychotic behavior. She was just explaining that she was concerned about the health of her child. And what happened was Wachenheim was a legal assistant, a lawyer actually, with a six-figure income, writing comprehensive and clear documents for judges. She was in New York City, and she'd go to her doctor saying she was concerned that her child was somehow defective, that because the child had fallen and she viewed it as her fault, and the child was going to be disabled for his entire life. So what she did to prevent her suffering and the suffering of her young boy, she strapped the child to her chest and jumped out their 8th floor window to their mutually intended death. As things would happen, she landed on her back, and the child, protected by her body, survived with only bruises. I don't think anyone can dispute the sincerity of her belief, the fact that it was completely delusional, the fact that her 13-page suicide note was this rambling and mostly incoherent nonsense, but within it, you could glean the reason she did this. And that reason was she loves her child, but it's a terrible kind of love. She can't stand the thought of him suffering his entire life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what would happen if, I'm sorry? What would happen if the opposite occurred?
Yeah, go ahead, Barry.
If the opposite occurred and she landed on her chest, the child would obviously have died, and she and her broken body would be sent to a prison for an extended period of time because there was no prior detectable psychosis. Her doctors didn't detect it. Her husband, who was very involved, did not detect it. Her children's doctors didn't detect anything other than she was concerned. She thought this is just the first time mom who was very attentive to these. Nobody detected this craziness in time. There's no detectable delusions or hallucinations or confusion or cognitive disorganization. There are no mood swings, nothing to be detected. And yet it's very clear that Cynthia Wachenheim was suffering from postpartum psychosis, but there would be no prior evidence of it, and it would be treated as, well, here.
Treated as an overprotective mom, basically, right?
Yes, but in the criminal courts, it would be treated as a person who was sane and just wanted to get back at her husband. But it's so easy to allege that your boyfriend or your husband was being the real victim of this, getting back at him, because all couples fight. You can find something.
So that's often used in these cases, and we see it a lot in cases of what's called altruistic villicide. That is, it sounds crazy, but you love your child so much, you take their life to protect them, maybe protect them from hell or something like that in a delusional mind. And oftentimes prosecutors instead turn it into, because of the waxing and waning or lack of a long history, it's hard for defense attorneys to use the insanity defense, and often prosecutors will use defenses like Barry was talking about. We'll use positions that Barry was talking about, such as that they were trying to get even, and reject that there was mental illness there. So it's hard to, get a defense going in terms of insanity, right?
Worse, the law defining insanity is very harmful in these cases. Take Andrea Yates. Andrea Yates had this extensive history of actual diagnosis after her fourth child of postpartum psychosis and numerous suicide attempts. Yet she nearly was executed. It was only because in her first trial, the jury could not agree that she should be executed, that she was given a natural life sentence. And it was only because of perjury on the part of the doctors testifying towards testifying that she was sane at the time, did she get a new trial and thus get found not guilty by reason of insanity. As a consequence of this successful defense, she's likely to spend her lifetime in a mental institution, which is just totally wrong for a situation involving this temporary illness. And the problem that Yates had, despite this extensive history of mental illness and psychosis, was that she could tell right from wrong. And that has become the very limited standard. We've returned to something called the McNaughton rule from the 19th century. It got expanded to allow for somebody to be found not guilty by reason of insanity if they lack sufficient capacity to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. This standard got abandoned because of a reaction to the not guilty by reason of insanity that Hinckley had after he shot Ronald Reagan. It's a matter of swinging back and forth under pressure. And unfortunately, we're now left with a situation which, for multiple reasons, it's very difficult for somebody to be found not guilty by reason of insanity in a postpartum case.
Great. Thank you so much, Barry, for that important overview. And You touched on altruistic suicide, Dr. Feingold. I apologize. I keep calling you Susan because we're great friends.
Fine.
Yeah,
I call her that too.
We'll go back and forth.
I answer to it.
Great, good. We'll go back and forth. I thought it would be helpful to touch on. You mentioned that we can see breaks in reality in women or psychosis when there is a severe depression. But I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about bipolar disorder and the linkage for just a moment. Do you mind addressing that? And then I also would love to hear you address the difference between psychosis and OCD or intrusive thoughts, particularly for those providers on the phone to understand those distinctions.
Great point. So what we believe at this point, and we're still, doing research and learning more, we don't know everything, so we're constantly learning more about it. And there has been probably less investigation about postpartum psychosis than postpartum depression and anxiety disorders, which we now more often refer to as perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. So we're starting to do more, and I think the reason we haven't done more research in the past is it's a really difficult topic for people. And Postpartum Support International, in fact, just a side note, and then I'll get to your question, has started a postpartum psychosis task force to address more clearly these issues, and hopefully more information will be coming out in the next years. There'll be more attention on it. But what we believe at this point, what our research tells us, is that oftentimes there's a link between postpartum psychosis and bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression, if people are as old as I am on this call, but it's now known as bipolar disorder because there's mood swings. And it's a serious illness. It's very biochemically based, even though certainly stressors can set it off. Well, what we know is that for some women, that their first episode, maybe they had a family history of bipolar disorder, and they weren't really prepared for expecting having a baby and becoming psychotic. But for some women, they don't have a history until their hormones and all the endocrine changes take place during pregnancy, and then with childbirth, postpartum, because hormones go up significantly during pregnancy and then drop very quickly following delivery. And so for some women, it sets off their first episode of a bipolar disorder. And these are the women that we think are, from our understanding at this point, are having this psychosis very close to the time they deliver, often in the first week or weeks following delivery, sometimes first hours. Whereas in postpartum depression, and we kind of say both can happen anytime in the first year, but but with postpartum depression, more often symptoms can present anytime in the first 3 to 4 months. With postpartum psychosis, it's often much more rapid. However, as I said before, so people just need to be aware that it is possible that someone's depression becomes so severe and so deep that they start to become psychotic. So that's sort of another place where you can see psychosis. But many of these women, seem to have postpartum psychosis that, in the classic sense of something that happened early on. So I think that responds to that. You make a good point in terms of what's the difference from psychosis and obsessive compulsive disorder. Well, obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder, and it's under the umbrella of anxiety disorders. And what happens is women who have postpartum obsessive compulsive disorder. The most common thing that we hear about, although it's not the only obsession, certainly after working this field for over 25 years, I've heard a lot of obsessive thoughts. So obsessive thoughts are distressing, upsetting thoughts that are frightening. And so it increases the women's anxiety. And the ones that we hear about a lot are thoughts of hurting the baby. And when a woman has those thoughts, sometimes for someone who is not really educated in terms of the difference between psychosis and OCD, might get scared, a clinician even, that these, as well as the woman herself, that these thoughts mean she could hurt her baby, because these thoughts might come out of nowhere and she can't stop thinking about them or picturing ways she might hurt the baby intentionally or unintentionally. The fact that there's anxiety with the thought is, as a clinician, calming, because it means it's OCD, that it causes distress. And that's very different than the psychosis and a really impaired belief that this is a good idea and this would be for the child's best interest, and so there's quite a difference. And sometimes, I remember, without belaboring the point too much, having a case years ago in which my patient was reported, she had told her pediatrician, a young pediatrician, that she was having these terrible thoughts that were scaring her about hurting the baby. And the pediatrician called Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, and they started to work to take the child away. And of course, that only increased the mother's anxiety that, oh my God, maybe I am a danger, which kind of creates a cycle of anxiety. So it's really important differential diagnosis between psychosis and OCD. They're totally different, but I think that sometimes there's a misunderstanding that women who have these thoughts, kind of what I say to them is, that's reassuring to me that it's causing you distress. This is anxiety. These are not the women that hurt their babies.
Great. That's so helpful. And we do know that confusion over those issues causes women to not speak up, particularly if their providers don't understand the nuances and these terrible things happen. Thank you, Susan. I'm going to move on. And if anyone does have additional questions about these differences with postpartum psychosis and the link to bipolar disorder, we want to hear from you in the question and answer section of today's webinar. Go ahead and use that question feature in your GoToWebinar control panel. But let's move on to this exciting new law, the first of its kind in the U.S. And I first want to acknowledge that what's so great about this work is that usually nonprofits are behind movements around legal change, advocacy organizations. And what is so neat about this work is that you two, though affiliated with multiple nonprofits, really became the team that drove a resolution and passage of this law. And so I think that's just critical to point out that you don't necessarily have to be tied to a nonprofit organization in the state that's doing advocacy work to make a difference. I think you are considered a dream team, and it might be hard to find another pair like you in another state. Let's be sure to note that. But again, really important to know that you did this essentially on your own. Before you comment on that, I also want you to just start out by sharing with us, how did this law come to be and who was your champion? And I know you've shared with me, each of you, at a conference that we attended together, how this came to be. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about who I think was a judge and really became concerned about these women. Do either one of you mind taking that question?
I'll take that one. And Barry can add in. So it really started, and our champion, in fact, he isn't a judge. He's just He's our champion is Bill Ryan. I think no one would disagree with that. He was a retired assistant deputy director of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. And Bill's always been very interested and with prison reform. And he used his retirement to basically visit inmates in prisons and fight for, which he's doing currently, for bringing the parole system back to Illinois and various other injustices. Well, in the process of that, he was visiting really every prison in Illinois. And as he started to visit inmates at Logan Correctional Facility, which is a women's facility, he began hearing and really listening to stories of numerous women who were serving long or lifetime sentences for crimes committed when they were mentally ill with postpartum disorders, most often psychosis. And Bill, being who he is, was really struck with the injustice of it. He began talking to Illinois Representative Linda Chapellavia from the House, and together they took up that cause. So they were the initial champions who sponsored HB 1764, which is now turned into the law, PA 100-0574. So I got involved after that. The bill was referred to the Judiciary and Criminal Committee in the House, where it was amended and debated till the end of March in 2017. And interestingly enough, sometimes, opportunities present themselves to us and we have a chance to say yes or, yay or nay, And so in March of 2017, I happened to see among my thousands of emails an email from a fellow PSI member and the coordinator of the pregnancy and postpartum program at Amita Health, Lida Semenis, who many might know for her work.
Mm-hmm.
And the email was really requesting someone with perinatal expertise to go to Springfield the next day to testify before the House Judiciary Committee on HB 1764, which dealt with perinatal disorders. And at the time, I thought it was a one-day commitment and just the right thing to do. So I looked into it. Anyway, it was far from a one-day commitment, and I never imagined how it could lead both Barry and I into this path of perinatal legal advocacy, which has become such a focus in our life, both professionally and personally. So, so basically I went to Springfield with Lida and met with Bill Ryan and Representative Chapellavia and testified in the House committee, and it passed unanimously that day, I'm happy to say. And I never kind of imagined. Anyway, then it moved to the full House and passed there. And then as things have it, legislatively, it moved to the Senate and was assigned a sponsor in the Senate, who was Senator Toy Hutchinson. And then became, then it went to committee in the Senate and started to be debated there. And at this point is when Barry kind of jumped in, because I was surprised to find that there was an opponent. So in the state's attorney's office, there was a lobbyist and prosecutor for the state's attorney's office, Matt Jones, who was in strong opposition to the bill being passed, with sort of an aim to kill this bill. And at this point, I was already invested in it, and within a very short time, maybe it was one day, we had to pull something together. And I was really over my head because he was concerned about separation of powers and said the bill was unconstitutional. It was not my own field. And Barry, who's my life partner and now also my partner in perinatal advocacy, was willing to get involved, talk to Matt over the phone, couldn't change his opinion, and then Barry wrote a brief, and both of us headed to Springfield to testify in 2017. So we both had to testify about this bill after Barry sent the brief to Matt Jones and also all the committee members. Barry, I don't know if you want to take it from there.
Well, I could. Susan and I had known one another for about 5 years when this arose. And sometime in those 5 years, she showed me, in some context or another, a quote from Margaret Mead that I never imagined would be applicable to myself or her, or certainly not us together. And that quote basically said, "Never doubt that a small group of committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Like I say, I never imagined that I'd be in the position of actually acting that out. And in fact, I took a look at that and looked at it kind of skeptically. But the job was kind of thrust upon me to prove that Matt Jones was incorrect in his evaluation that the law was unconstitutional. We might as well skip for now what I did and how I showed that it was constitutional, other than it was a constitutional separation of powers issue. I had to very quickly research and crank out a brief on it, about 5 or 6 pages long, that I, as quickly as I could, so that on Monday it could be shipped out overnight mail to the state legislature, or rather the criminal law committee of the state Senate, arriving there Tuesday morning while we drove. Yes?
Do you mind
sharing,
Barry, it's Joy, do you mind sharing when the initial law was introduced, did it look like the law that we see up on our screen now, that really postpartum depression or psychosis would be mitigating factors in sentencing, or was it introduced in a way that was much broader, which caused the opposition?
No, this was a very mild law. The significance of it is not that it's broad. The significance is that the first time in the United States the statute on criminal law mentions postpartum illnesses. It's the first time in Illinois that the courts can change a legal sentence. In fact, the first time that anyone other than the governor could change a legal sentence. And it gives a new sentencing hearing to a group of women whose mental illnesses were not properly recognized. However, it's a very narrow law. It affects 20 women. And while you may say that, because it only affects 20 women, it's insignificant. Well, you could also say the fact that James Meredith was allowed to enter Ole Miss as an undergraduate only affected one person. It changed the law forever. And we're hoping that this will be the gateway, the door opening that will change the law forever throughout the U.S. So it'll be more in line with the British Infanticide Act and other acts in approximately 30 other countries, which are much broader and much more protected. This law does not change the sentencing range. It still has mandatory minimums, but it's broken the door open, much like a law in 1830 in Maine was the very first law that allowed women to control their own property, provided their husbands were incapacitated. This spread, and by 1850 or so, it was widespread. Illinois is a great place to start these things. We've had several such instances. You've all heard of public defenders' offices, first in Illinois. The Juvenile Court Act, first in Illinois. Workers' Comp, second in Illinois. It can come from here. Thank you.
Yeah, Illinois, now our focus has really been to help other states so this is sort of a starting place, and in fact, with a small group of advocates, we've been helping in Massachusetts to write a more comprehensive law that includes treatment and a program following, jail time, basically. I forgot what it's called now, but anyway, I'll probably think of it. But a much broader, comprehensive law in Massachusetts and we're hoping this will spread like wildfire. So, no pun intended, since we're talking to California, but we're hoping that it will change the law throughout the country to put the U.S. in line with the UK and as Barry said, 30 other countries that have had such laws. The UK has had a law since 1938, so we're way behind many developed countries. And in our country, it's been more about, more punitive than let's get these people help. And it's just ridiculous for a woman who has had a temporary psychosis and committed a crime, whatever the crime is, for them to spend the rest of their life in prison rather than to get treatment. So,
absolutely. I have a follow-up question. No, I think it's helpful. One of the things that you're sort of hitting on, and you can see on the screen here right now, is how to get legislation like this or even better passed in other states. And Barry, you hit on the fact that Illinois is pretty progressive around criminal justice and other issues, which was one reason why this seemed to work, perhaps, right? And lots of reasons, as we know, that stars have to align on a number of fronts. One thing that I would like to point out, and feel free to add anything here, Susan, if you'd like, is that Illinois has had long-standing maternal mental health legislation on the books for years. Massachusetts is the other state that has also had legislation addressing maternal mental health outside of the legal system on the books. We know that New Jersey was one of the first states that has addressed maternal mental health as well. There are a couple other states, and now California, luckily, can say that they're joining this pack. To me, it seems like it's critical to address the clinical issues first, right, and then address the legal system. And in fact, in California, there was advice from some very powerful folks in the legislature that said you don't dare start with the legal system or even do it concurrently, that you really have to build awareness in the legislature for these disorders generally. And so you may have something to touch on to that, related to that point. And then one last thing I want to mention is that as you shared, and I think in part because of those laws, that this law was actually drafted kind of organically through the system, kind of on a, we might use the word on a grassroots basis, meaning that our organizations and maternal mental health leadership didn't have to influence. It happened on its own, which is phenomenal. And that happened with the federal legislation bringing postpartum depression out of the Shadows Act, which was brought forth from a congresswoman in Massachusetts because she learned, right, watching things unfold after state legislation was introduced, that this is a critical issue. And so I just don't want that point to be lost here, in that starting with the clinical-oriented legislation in a state really does seem to be a critical first step. And Susan, do you have anything you want to add on that point?
Well, I think you make some great points. I guess the only thing I'd like to add is, and maybe it was naive of, Barry and myself, but that you're right. It's really, a lot of this happened because of, it was really very grassroots, starting with Bill and then Barry and I helping to usher the bill through. And so I guess what I'd like to stress for your listeners is that it doesn't have, sometimes we always feel these issues are too big, we can't make a difference, which speaks to Margaret Mead's quote, but that we're just, what can we do as individuals? And I guess maybe we were both naive enough to go into this without thinking we needed to get backing from the psychiatric community, from the American Psychological Association, or others, and we just sort of, kind of got swept into it. And then part of what made it successful, certainly it started with Bill Ryan, but Barry and I kind of watched this bill. I think persistence and just ushering the legislation through, because there were various obstacles that came up that could have made this bill die many times. Deadlines that weren't met at the end where we thought it was a done deal, and then the Senate didn't notify the House that it had passed the Senate, so the House never sent the bill to the governor for signature. So even all the way up to the end, had we not been following it and been sort of ushering it through and being really mindful of that, I think there were various times it could have died. But yeah, I just want people to know it doesn't always take a big effort. It just takes some persistence and dedication and sort of a watchful eye, because yeah, it could die at any point is kind of what we learned.
Yeah, I
yes,
think that's such a great point.
So I want to first of all congratulate you on the work you've done. I think you could make a presentation on this yourself. All I could add to what you and Susan have done and said is that in the future, there are better ways to approach this. Yes, as you point out, Joy, you have to respect the information you get from the powerful members of the legislature. We were fortunate that we didn't have anyone seriously opposing it. This was a modest change in the law. And I'll never forget one of the members of the committee saying, to Matt Jones, the objector, are you saying we can do nothing to correct the known wrong? Well, there you have it. The law is minor, but it's a start. In the future, some things that can be done to make the law more acceptable is a better name. I mean, consider the names that you've heard about, some onerous legislation, Patriot Act. If you look at it, it eliminates all kinds of rights. Right to work laws, pro-life, who could be pro-death. You need to have a better name than the Infanticide Act. And as you pointed out, it was easier to get through information on identification and prevalence of postpartum illnesses than a law that would exonerate some women who suffered from this. That's unfortunate, but true. And that can be used to help pass more advanced legislation on this point by emphasizing the treatment and the need for recognition and the need for training medical professionals and legal professionals regarding this illness. And if that fails, then the law should recognize that as a mitigating circumstance.
Really helpful. Well, we have this final slide besides the quote that you shared earlier. Barry, is there anything that you want in closing to address, Susan or Barry, on the Brooke? You can go back one more slide. On this final slide, is there anything here that you didn't get a chance to address that you want to? And then we'll have time for Q&A.
Okay, so I would just say, that kind of, I would reinforce Barry's point about the name. And, one of the names that, in fact, we talked about in Massachusetts and suggested, and I think they are going to use that name, is the New Mom and Infant, New Mom and Infant Safety Act Health Safety Act, something like that. Much better than calling it an Infanticide Act, because it really, it's very provocative to call it an Infanticide Act, but it has been called that in many countries and often referred to that in Illinois. The other thing would be the last point, that even though it only, it was pretty much a small group, Bill and us and Lida at some points as well, it's really better to act as a group and to not as individuals. We were a very small group, but, pretty persistent group, I guess, is what you might say, but it's not ideal. And so especially in crafting legislation that's broader and more comprehensive, which I think is what is being done in Massachusetts. And even though, you made the point, like maybe we, and certainly I think the legislators know how to do this, but, I wouldn't discourage people who are states from introducing a bill, because I know when I testified, for instance, in the House and in the Senate, even though there were some things in place in Illinois, basically the people in the committee knew very little about perinatal disorders. So part of my testimony was, and really the focus was to educate them about the range of postpartum illnesses and what this looks like, and how this would be a groundbreaking legislation, and that it's already legislation that are laws in all these different countries. Barry wants to say something, I'm going to turn it over to him.
Yes, I'd like to actually change bullet point number 4 and clarify it. You need a sponsor who's in the legislature. That's absolutely essential. No bill can be advanced without a sponsor, but it shouldn't be just a sponsor. The law has a much better chance if it has bipartisan support, which is indicated by a sponsor both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, or maybe multiple sponsors in both parties. And so in case the more the merrier, and the more widespread the general philosophies of the sponsorship is, the more likely this bill will be advanced. Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, I think that would help it be more successful.
Excellent. You two have been phenomenal. I want to make just a couple of announcements before we open it up for Q&A. And if you do have questions for Barry or Dr. Feingold today, please go ahead and type them in right now using the question feature of your GoToWebinar control panel. It's a long, thin gray box in that rectangular, what we call control panel. We'd love to hear if you have any questions. And before we turn it over to questions, I want to share with folks that there is another state that has recently passed legislation, not around infanticide in the law, but around maternal mental health screening and support. That's Florida, and they also won an innovation award in advocacy and policy. Their webinar was held previously and is available on the 2020 Mom website. You'll see that on the Innovation Award page if you're looking for inspiration and maybe a little too shy to start with infanticide in the law and want to kind of create the foundational law. Make sure you take a look and listen to that webinar. We also want to share that 2020 Mom is looking to launch a learning network to connect people like you who are interested in legislative change. That learning network we hope will launch in July. We're still securing some final funding, and just want to make sure you know that that's a way we'll all be able to connect. And Barry and Dr. Feingold, we of course hope to have you join us as our guests in that network. It will be a listserv, a file sharing capability, a stream, documentation or a chat stream on various topics that will be recorded in perpetuity. I'm not saying that word correctly. Be available for folks to look up forever in this chat stream, if you will. So a really great resource. We'll also do some webinars, and just want to make sure you all know that we are very interested in launching a legislative circle in that learning network. And then finally, just want to thank each of you for your leadership and really, as you have shared, almost part-time, maybe full-time work on this groundbreaking legislation in Illinois. Yep, thank you both very much. We'll take a look at questions here that are coming through, and it doesn't look like we have any questions. Barry and Dr. Feingold, I assume you're willing to share your email address with folks should they have questions later. Great. So you're welcome to email us at 2020 Mom with questions. And there we go. Thank you, Brooke, for also adding or showing the slide, the introductory slide with our email addresses up here on the screen. And please don't be shy. We are very excited to bring this content to you and hope that it will inspire you to take action in your own states. Once again, Dr. Feingold and Barry Lewis, thank you so much for joining us today. And those of you who haven't yet registered for the remainder of the Innovation Award Series, please take a look at doing that and consider doing that. Two more categories, and both the winner and the runner-up, if you will be presenting in both our care and our community action series. So thank you so much. We hope to see all of you on another webinar soon. And one final thanks to our funder, the Zoma Foundation, for supporting the Innovation Awards program. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.